Vladimir Putin seems to have thought that the regime in Kyiv could be toppled in 10 days through a blitzkrieg operation carried out from Russian and Belarusian territory. But instead, he has made the political situation in Russia more fragile and volatile than at any time since the 1990s. Could Putin's aggressive expansionist policies in Ukraine actually signal the disintegration of Europe's last empire? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like our guest speakers, as it really helps other people in the audience to discover the fantastic experts that we feature on the channel. Anton Shekhovtsov is a Ukrainian political scientist, academic, and writer. He is known for writing about the European radical right, and in particular, its connections to Russia. Shekhovtsov was born in Sevastopol and studied at the Sevastopol National Technical University. Anton has also worked as visiting fellow researcher at the University of Northampton as part of the Radicalism and New Media Research Group. He then went on to complete a PhD in Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. He is editor of the Explorations of the Far-Right book series and sits on the board of the open source Fascism Journal of Comparative Fascist Studies. Anton's works have been featured in OpenDemocracy, Chatham House, Foreign Affairs, the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, and the Aspen Institute. Anton, I've been reading your articles and posts for many, many months throughout the war, and it is a huge pleasure to welcome you to the channel today.
Hello, Jonathan, and thank you for having me.
Well, not at all. It's a huge pleasure. Now, let's get stuck into probably which is one of the more contentious questions of the war, and that is Russian aggression against Ukraine. The propaganda narratives would have it that this is Putin's war, thereby letting the Russian people off the hook. But can we understand what's going on as the act of one man, or does the Russian population bear collective responsibility for the war that's been unleashed by their state?
Well, if we're talking about different aspects of the war, we can have different answers to your question. I am convinced that it is no longer just a Putin's war, that it is a Russian war against Ukraine. What I do believe is Putin's bit in this Russian-Ukrainian war is the genocidal element. I do believe that it is entirely Putin's project to eradicate the Ukrainian nation. We see, and we know from history that the Russian aggression is not the first time that Russia is trying to occupy Ukraine, but at the same time, I don't think that the Russian war against Ukraine would have had this genocidal element. It would just be probably occupation. It would probably even enslavement of the Ukrainian nation, but not the eradication of it. This eradication, this genocidal element, I'm convinced it's totally Putin's wish, and it's this is where we can say that it's Putin's war. But at the same time, now we see that Russians do bear collective responsibility. I don't think that we can extend the term Russian guilt or a collective guilt on the entire nation, because guilt has a more legal aspect, legal angle to what we are talking. We definitely some people who have committed war crimes against humanity, and crimes against the civil population. Some of them are guilty, of those crimes. But as for the Russian population, I think that collective responsibility is the right term to use.
And let's come to Putin's particular hatred and what that's actually directed against. But first of all, I want to tackle that idea of collective culpability, because if we go back, and many people on the channel have quoted Tolstoy and War and Peace during the course of the interviews that I've been doing, and one man cannot wage war. And you obviously have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers at the front who are following orders, whether those orders are right or wrong. But behind the scenes, you have the infrastructure of the propagandists who are, inciting this hatred and have been for many years. You also have the Siloviki who are suppressing protests. One could say they're culpable as well. And by extension, and I think some people might find this going too far, but for me, I think it's incredibly important. These sanctions were supposed to crash the Russian economy. That hasn't happened because there are some extraordinary, talented, and intelligent economists who've been able to keep the Russian economy functioning. For me, they're as culpable in keeping Putin's war machine going as anybody else. So how do we apportion this culpability?
Well, definitely there is that the Putin regime has a technocratic aspect, and this is the economy, because the economy of the Russian state is being managed by people who have no real connection to the ideology, or if we can talk about any ideology of the Putin regime, but you have this technocratic, non-political aspect of the workings of the Russian machine, of the Russian machinery, and they, of course, they do bear responsibility, and probably even they are guilty of what is happening, because now they are also all those economists, the Russian bank, for example, and the major banks and major financial infrastructures, they are directly involved in the workings of the of the infrastructure on the occupied territories, where you have all those crimes against the civilian population, where they are committed. So you have this direct involvement of even of those technocrats who are not political, who may actually they might be even against the invasion, this full-fledged invasion from last year, but it doesn't mean that they are not guilty of this.
And let's turn to that question then of Putin. Where does this loathing of Ukraine come from? Is it based on a sort of racial animus that he has? Where in the past, or his past, personal past, might this come from? Or does he just detest the idea of a territory that doesn't obey his political will, as it were?
You see, Putin and people like him, they see, or they believe that Ukrainian nation does not exist as a separate identity, as a separate entity, national entity. For them, Ukrainians, or who call themselves Ukrainians, are confused Russians. So he believes in this greater Russian nation that would also feature, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians, and he believes that this exists, the existence of this greater Russian nation. And Ukrainians, if they think that they are somehow separate, then they are, well, not even confused, and that they're enemies of his own project, which he has in mind. And so Ukrainians who want to be westernized, who want to be modernized and democratized, they are for him a mistake that needs to be eliminated. Because it's not really about the new Soviet Empire. It's not creating this, or not trying to bring back the Soviet Union, but he does want to bring again the Soviet geopolitical might, or something that could be considered as the Soviet geopolitical might. He wants the same. He doesn't want the Soviet Union. He wants the geopolitical might that the Soviet Union had. And Ukrainians stand in his way in many, in many aspects. As I said, the first aspect is that they undermine his own vision of what the greater Russian nation is. Without those Ukrainians, without the subjugation of those Ukrainians, without bringing them back to the Russian civilizational project, his own project becomes impossible. And he's an aging person. He has been in power for more than 20 years. And I do believe that some things, even probably ideological, have become very important for him, and they constitute what he can call his legacy, and his legacy, or his vision of the legacy. So, the project of his legacy involves this eradication of the Ukrainian nation. It's either the Ukrainian nation exists, either the Ukrainian project exists and is westernized and becomes part of the West, and then his legacy does not, because this is a completely different project. Or his legacy exists, his own project exists, and then the Ukraine does not. So it's I think last year I compared this to this dilemma in Harry Potter series about Voldemort and Harry Potter. It's only one of them can exist, and this is what we are facing here. It's either Putin and his project, or Ukraine and the Ukrainian project.
And you can make that comparison as well to that quote of Voldemort about magical blood. He says, "I don't want to kill any of you, if you follow my command and control. But the minute you don't, you're tainted." And this goes some way to explain what seems to be the highly illogical and irrational act, where the most number of victims of torture, filtration, terror, and of course, destruction of cities and homes are predominantly those regions of Ukraine that were primarily Russian-speaking, or whose first language is Russian. And of course, he's treating them in the most callous way. And if we accept this idea that he sees them as tainted, either by Ukrainian nationalism, or probably in his mind, tainted by the US, the CIA, and outside forces, that goes some way to explaining what seems to be a fairly irrational behavior.
Well, it's not only this. I think we should not forget that the rise of Putin to power took place after apparently the FSB and his colleagues blew up buildings in Russia itself, where hundreds of people became victims of those, how they explained were terrorist attacks by the Chechens, but which were most likely the work of the FSB and probably Putin himself somehow. So it all started with actually killing Russian people. And if we look at political warfare, Russian malign influence, something that I'm dealing quite actively today, I can see that all those patterns, all those techniques, all those tactics that are being used by Russian stakeholders, by Russian actors in the West, they had been first tested on the Russian territory, against the Russian population, against the Russian society, how to undermine the society, how to undermine the civil society in Russia, how to make people, more isolated, more alienated from each other, so they would not be able to produce any tangible opposition, political opposition to the Putin regime. But those are the same techniques that are being used now in Europe and the West in general. But again, they had been all of them had been tested before. So you see that Putin has no problem with killing ethnic Russians because he has this higher goal. And in itself is actually quite rational. It's just the belief that he chose to believe. We also are guided by the beliefs that for some people can be irrational, but still for us they constitute something rational. It's not only emotional, but something rational. Ukrainians do believe that they have a Ukrainian identity which is separate and which is different from the identity of the Russians. And he believes in a different thing. And here you have this clash. If only he believed that the Ukrainians were really a separate national, nation, a separate people that have a very distinct identity. Actually, probably then he would not, there would be no urge for him to try to eradicate this nation, because there is also this fear, but not only on his part, but on the part of the Russian ruling elites, that Ukrainians, successful Ukraine, a successful Ukraine, which becomes part of the West, may be a very bad lessons for Russians living in Russia, who could look at Ukraine's successes and think, well, why can't we do the same? Why can't we become part of the West? And this constitutes one of those fears. But the solution, actually the rational solution to this question, is to say, well, Ukraine would not be able to present any bad lessons to the Russians, because they are just a separate people. They can go their own way. They're in no way they are an example for the Russians in Russia. And actually, this I think is a mistake, even for some Ukrainians and for some Westerners who think that Ukraine's development and democratization may become an example for the Russians. Well, if we believe that Ukraine is a separate and very different national entity, that it doesn't mean that it will produce any example. And we see that, especially you have these, very often, you have these comments coming from Ukrainians who would be saying, well, addressing the Russians, so why don't you do your own Maidan? Why don't you go and protest? Well, we did this several times. We had successful protests, but it means that at the back of their minds, they do believe that Ukrainians are the same as the Russians. So they would deny this in one aspect, but then corroborate the same, I think, fallacy in some other aspects. But I think we should keep some integrity when we are discussing the differences between the Russians and Ukrainians.
And of course, that same fallacy is even more prevalent, isn't it, in Western minds, and potentially percolates through to some foreign policy, which is the idea that somehow, as you say, Russia will behave differently. We're expecting street protests. We're expecting, similar manifestations that you would get in European cities and Ukraine. In these circumstances, we're also somehow expecting these events to trigger a disintegration of the Russian Empire, because we think that if that was happening in our territories, this is how people would behave. It's not at all the case, is it, that either disintegration of the Russian Empire or rising up of nationalities that have been suppressed for centuries, it's not at all the case that this is inevitable.
Well, absolutely, I agree, and there is, I think, an element of sort of Orientalism about this. We are expecting the Russian population to behave the way we, in our imagination, would have behaved if we had been in their place, in their shoes. So there is this fallacy, and unfortunately. Well, the question here also, where does it lead? Where does our understanding that Russians are different from Western nations, where does it lead to? Does it lead to, well, let's then leave the Russians alone, and not support in any way any democratization attempt in Russia? Or what should we do? So, and here you have different dilemmas and different opinions, because, well, a good example here is China and its treatment of the Uyghurs, of this ethnic minority and religious minority in China. There have been several reports, many reports, that these policies, these Chinese policies, can be described as a genocide of the Uyghurs, and yet Western politicians prefer to keep silent on this issue, And not only because there is a huge, trade between China and the West, but also there is an understanding that China is so different from the West that, well, then let's just not even talk about this. And this is the genocide happening right now, you know? And still, we are keeping silent on this because we believe that they are too different. We will not be able to change them somehow, to democratize them. So we keep ignoring one of the major crimes of the beginning of the century.
And you could extend that too, couldn't you? I mean, this is a future episode, which I'm hoping to do, looking at the Chinese social credit system, looking at the surveillance state. You could extend that same logic to say that China is a more successful autocracy. It is able to suppress dissent far more efficiently and successfully than Russia seems able to do so. And their hybrid informational system is far much more controlled with, their internet firewall and so on. And even dissenters are cracked down on, to some extent, prior to February 2022, far more ruthlessly. Is it because they are effectively more efficient that they will receive less criticism from the West? It's because Russian repression is so inefficient, so brutal, so obvious, and at times so ridiculous that we're able to call it out more effectively.
Well, there are several points here. Well, first, if we're talking, for example, if we're talking about the censorship and the internet, compared to Russia, where the internet was developing under rules which were quite liberal, starting from the 90s, from the end of the 90s, Russia developed its internet and its media sphere, its media environment as a legitimate part of the global environment and global internet. It was very different in China when they started developing their own media environment, already knowing that would be subject to censorship. So they never tried to integrate the Chinese internet or the Chinese media into the global media, because they knew that they would control what their citizens were reading. Obviously that's never 100%. Although I think North Korea has probably reached those, not 100% of control and censorship. But for China, it was still a bit different. Not a bit different, but really different from Russia, where the project of the Chinese internet and the media area were already developed in the that had this not a firewall that came later, but as part of the control system. So here you have a difference. Well, of course, there are many political differences. Again, Russia had a very brief moment of what can be called pseudo-democracy in the 90s. Very brief period. Obviously, never before had Russia had any experience of democracy. That is also a problem. But at least they had this moment, and then the repressions, the growing authoritarianism in Putin's Russia, that happened gradually. It did not happen overnight. So they had these remnants of some liberties and freedoms. China is very different. They never try to give to the Chinese population the access to the to free thoughts, to media freedoms. Never try that.
And if we're going to be crude, we could characterize the relations between, say, the West and China and the West and Russia as mutual miscomprehension. But actually, hearing what you're saying here, it sounds like we continue to misunderstand Russian motivations. We continue to misunderstand how their system works. And yet, I think they have quite a good understanding of how our societies work. They may not believe in it. They may not want to copy the machinery of our state. They may want to just copy the economic benefits without the political system. Does that put us at a kind of imbalance? And does it mean that Russian disinformation narratives on some levels are quite successful because they have that advantage of perhaps understanding how we work better than we understand them?
Well, it's not. Well, it's a correct observation, but I would say it's not the observation from today. It has been correct even during the Cold War. The Soviets probably knew the weaknesses and sensitivities of the West even better than the West was aware of them. And so the Russians do have capabilities of exploiting those weaknesses, and democracy as such, it has weaknesses compared to the authoritarian regime. It doesn't mean that the democracy is weaker than authoritarianism, but there are weaknesses that authoritarianism may exploit or can exploit. One very good example, in my opinion, is the democratic process of making decisions. When in a democracy, you need to give voice to different groups who have their own interests, and this process becomes very long. The democratic process about making a decision. In an authoritarian regime, it's quite faster. You I'm really sorry. In an authoritarian regime, that process goes faster because you need only to hear voices of a handful of people or interest groups. So it's not like in a democracy. So and this is a weakness that authoritarian leaders can exploit when they are waging a political war against democracies or against a union of democracies, trying to make that process of making decisions even slower, try to undermine particular individuals or states that are engaged in those processes of making decisions. So there is a plethora of ways how an authoritarian regime, such as the Russian regime, can undermine the democratic process.
And an area that you are an absolute expert on, and I wanted to make sure I put this question to you with this opportunity to talk, and that is the influence of far-right organizations. Because another aspect of open societies is that until a group openly breaks the law, we cannot and do not crack down on them. That means that all sorts of extremist rhetoric and behavior can, to a certain extent, be tolerated. This is another area, isn't it, where Russia has tried to leverage the weaknesses of our democratic process by funding and supporting extremist organizations on both the left and the right. But I suspect, out of my audience, many will jump up and say that the left is the greatest threat, and some will say that the right is the greatest threat. And I think that is indicative of how successful Russia is. Even within the audience that supports Ukraine, there is still this kind of divisiveness of view as to where the problem lies. But it's not just materially that right-wing organizations are supported by Russia. It's also strategically, isn't it? And with techniques and tactics. How, I'd love to hear about your research around that and how difficult it is to prove, where Russian support, either strategically or materially, is being inputted.
A few years ago, I published a book called The Russia and the Western Far Right, Tango Noir. And at the same time, I never wanted to say that the major threat to the European security or stability came from those relations between Russia and the far right. It was just a topic of the far right was and still is a major factor in my academic expertise, and I was interested to see investigate those links. But to those who would say that the lefts are a danger, or far left is a danger, or the far right is a danger, I would say again, despite the fact that I published a book specifically looking at the connection between Russia and the far right in Europe, I would say the major threat comes from the corrupt mainstream political forces in the West. They are, for Russia, is a plan A. For the Russian stakeholders, for the Russian officials, it is much more beneficial to corrupt mainstream politicians, mainstream officials who are part of the ruling elite in the West than to corrupt the far right or the far left. It's only when plan A does not work. So if it becomes too difficult to corrupt mainstream politicians, because then mainstream politicians think that those Russian connections are too toxic and they can be punished for those. And we see that increasingly since 2008, we have seen that support coming for Russia from the mainstream political forces has become weaker and weaker. It still enjoyed wide support, but still it just grew weaker. And so even if they cannot corrupt the mainstream, then the plan B is to use the more extreme forces, the radical forces, both on the far right and on the far left, to undermine European societies, Western societies, through those radical forces. But it's only plan B, as I said.
And how successful was that? We know that in many of the countries supporting the alliance for Ukraine, that this kind of political, how do you say it, this political involvement or this political corruption has lessened, or at least we are starting to build some resilience to it. But that's in stark contrast, isn't it, with the period 2014 through to 2022, where even though Russia was engaged in aggressive behavior, imperialist invasion, which I firmly believe that is. There's no way it's a civil war. The sanctions regime was extremely light. They had RT still broadcasting. They had the Nord Stream pipelines pumping energy into Europe to keep its economy going. And of course, they had a huge amount of influence in the West through oligarchs, through political relations, through investment in media, publishing organizations, and the rest of it, and of course, academia as well. So did that give them the sense that, even if the influence was weakening, that it wouldn't go away to the extent it was? Did that give them the confidence to actually launch that war in February last year?
Well, they definitely thought that the response from the West would have been weaker than it eventually was. So I think that was their belief. But at the same time, as I said, in many ways, this is the war, or at least the genocidal aspect of the war, is still Putin's project. And apparently he thought that probably that there was no time to try to subjugate Ukraine in a different manner, that he had to act quick to implement his genocidal project to eradicate the Ukrainian nation. So he decided to do this. So I think that was, for him, he didn't really look at the reaction of the West in this particular case. In February last year, probably he did care about potential Western responses before, but then at some point, and I think that was quite clear in various interviews, he would say, or his main argument would be that, well, you will hate us anyway. Talking to the West, you will hate us anyway. We don't have anything to lose. And I remember there was a discussion that Putin had inside Russia, and that was with governors or with officials and representatives of the economic elites and financial elites, where he probably describing a potential response from the West and first of all, economic sanctions, pretty hurtful economic sanctions against Russia. His argument was that they will introduce sanctions anyway. So it doesn't really matter how we behave. They will keep on doing this because they're trying to destroy Russia. This quite regular motive, quite regular narrative of the Russian elites that the West is conspiring against Russia and wants to destroy it. So it doesn't matter what we do, the West will try to destroy us. Yeah. So, and I think that was for him. That was the understanding. So he did not bother about potential Western response when he launched this invasion last year.
Now, Putin may have believed that due to his own complexes and paranoia, but it is, to my mind, not believable that those around him, apart from a few real extremists, actually bought into this idea. Because if you look at Solovyov with his son, who's a model in London, you look at all of the entourage around him, including the oligarchs, they all had interests, villas, family members in the West. They all would sort of travel where the brands use the products. I find it incredible and unbelievable that they would have bought into this. So it seems to me that for many, this was just a sort of propagandist conceit. And at the same time, you had billions upon billions upon billions of euros going to Russia to pay for energy, paid at market rate. So it's not about sort of ripping off Russia and stealing its resources. That just seems to me a sort of a smart propagandist conceit.
Well, unfortunately we don't know about or let me put it this way: we know very little of the decision-making process in the Kremlin. What we can think of is that very few people are actually involved in a decision-making process of that significance. So if we're talking about the launch of the invasion, I think that only probably less than 10 people knew what was happening. And I believe that those 10 people would somehow be rather on Putin's side when making those decisions, even if deep in their hearts they could be in the opposition to a decision to launch a major offensive against Ukraine. Then when asked directly by Putin, they would try to do their best not to appear weak, because this is something that I think Putin despises. So in order to keep whatever is left of their riches or influence or whatever, they needed to go along with what Putin decided or what they thought Putin would decide. Yeah. And I think we should know that every person in Russia who is successful, economically, financially successful, or politically successful, those people, they know that without the Putin regime, they would be nothing. So their stakes, they put their stakes on the survival of the Putin regime. No matter what mistakes it does, because without it, they owe Putin what they have. They owe this to Putin, so they would need to go along. I don't think they even have a choice, any real choice. Of course, they can flee, but remember how many strange deaths took place in the course of 2022. When chief managers from various Russian companies who decided that their fate lay elsewhere in the world, well, they turned out to be dead. Yeah, so they know what can happen to them if they go in a different direction. So it's a machine that is based on fear, and they may hate Putin, they may despise him, but they also fear him, and this is how this regime keeps itself together.
And of course, that is the key distinction, because another propagandist trope is that Ukraine is corrupt. They have oligarchs, they're run by oligarchs, so are we, so what? It's all the same. But actually, what you've just described here suggests that Ukrainian oligarchy is a completely different entity than Russian oligarchy. Wealth as an oligarch in Ukraine bought genuine power, and there was genuine competition between oligarchs for power and influence. No such thing exists in Russia. If you're a Russian oligarch, as you say, your wealth and power depends entirely on the state. And if you engage in politics, as Khodorkovsky did, then you will cease to become an oligarch. Your wealth will be taken back. It's leased from the state. And if you go too far, as you've just pointed out, with the energy executives and businessmen, you'll simply be rubbed out, and your fortune will be passed on to somebody else who is far more compliant to the state.
Well, absolutely, and I believe that there are no oligarchs as such in Russia, because the term itself, oligarchy, it supposes that people who are rich, they have political power, which is not the case in the Russian Federation. You may have wealth, you may be rich, but you will never have political power. And as you correctly mentioned, Khodorkovsky is a very good example. And there are some other minor examples to the same rule. If you want to do politics, well, you can only do one thing. Yeah, you can either be rich or do politics. But if you do politics, you have to follow the line. Yeah, and only you can be rewarded for what you do, but only if it is in line with the Kremlin line. For Ukraine, it's different, because Ukraine developed in quite a different manner since it became a post-Soviet country, since the 90s, since the beginning of the 90s. And actually, the different oligarch groups, they were, I think, like a proto-democracy in a way, because those were also interest groups who would have their own political interests, and since those businessmen would compete with each other, you would also have political competition in Ukraine. Actually, today, some quite knowledgeable and intelligent observers of the Ukrainian developments, they actually worried about the Ukrainian oligarchs' loss of their wealth and of their economic might, because if you don't have oligarchs, then you don't have this democratic system in a way. Well, this is, I think, it's an exaggeration to say, because you don't really need oligarchs to have a democracy. But oligarchs in Ukraine, they sort of secured the democratic process without any reference to actually how democracy should work. Yeah, it was like it was a natural democracy having those oligarchs. But now, of course, the developments are very different. We see the rise of new political projects, which are now only about the war, but the political space will be dramatically reconfigured in Ukraine, even after what we hope is going to be Ukrainian victory.
I think that's a fascinating point, which I know we're almost out of time, so we'll maybe have to dig into that in a future episode. But I mean, my perspective, I think, here is that oligarchy perhaps was an essential phase of development to move towards democracy. And what happens next, whether you have an overly powerful central state that could be a regression, or whether you have an emergence of a middle-class economy that actually leads to a further evolutionary stage of civil society. I think that's a big, big question for the post-war environment, and it's by no means certain. Although, given the extremely vibrant civil society and seeing how, I guess, stubborn and argumentative many Ukrainians are, many I've interviewed, it seems that there's a good chance that that next phase of evolution could happen. My very last question, just to wrap up, I think, and get clarity on my own mind, is about this genocidal intent, because clearly Russia always has, and perhaps always will, look to interfere in the affairs of the countries within its near abroad. We know that from Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan. Even now they're meddling in all of these countries' affairs. But this genocidal intent, if we say that it's not just Putin, that it goes a little bit further, which countries does that fall into and which does it not? I would assume here that Ukraine and Belarus would be seen as the core part of this Russian identity, this Rus, whereas they might want to interfere in Central Asia and Chechnya and all these other places, but they might not necessarily see them as innately Russian, so it might not have that genocidal layer to it.
You see, with interference, with malign influence, political warfare, you don't need to actually wage a genocidal war in order to influence a population or a society. Russia will, and it will keep interfering. It will keep on waging political warfare in the West, but it doesn't mean that they are trying to eliminate, I don't know, a Romanian nation as a nation, or a German nation as a nation. They're not. Even for Putin, it does not make any sense. It only comes to, I think, Ukraine and Belarus, as you correctly mentioned, because they are seen as the integral part of the greater Russian nation. And let me give you this example. As we all know, obviously, Putin is coming from the KGB. So what he has from his work as a KGB officer, then as an FSB officer, is the total, not even rejection, but well, he despises people. He despises traitors. This is something that I think all those KGB and FSB officers learned. You despise traitors. This is the lowest where you can go. So, and those traitors, they need to be eliminated. And there is no moral dilemma for people like Putin about the elimination of traitors. And we saw that, Skripal was, a victim of the attempt to kill him. And because he was a traitor for Putin and for the ruling elite in Russia, for this, Siloviki club, Ukrainians are seen as traitors of the greater Russian nation. So they need to be eliminated. Either they join the Russian civilizational project, or they should be destroyed. This is the logic behind this, this KGB meets, national identity projects. This is how they see it. If they're not with us, then they should not be anywhere, because they constitute an error. They are a mistake that needs to be corrected.
Well, Anton, I think that's made it incredibly clear there. And of course, it's a terrifying idea, but I think it's important to understand, the real causes of this war, rather than ascribing it to NATO expansion and all the rest of that kind of stuff. I know you have Dash. It's been a huge pleasure speaking to you. I think there's some incredibly insightful ideas here, which possibly in a future episode we can unpack further. But I'm incredibly grateful to you for the work you're doing, and I will put links into the description of this video, among other things, to a fantastic kind of infographic you've created to try and unpack the different narratives that Russia uses in different regions of the world. So we'll put a link to that in the video. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure talking to you.